Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural discussion at the Roundtable, Order Out of Chaos, Supply Chain Management and Logistics in Times of Disruption, brought to you by Roundtable Group. My name is Dan Rubin, the National Business Development Manager with Roundtable Group, the leading customized expert search and referral service with over 25 years of experience in locating and referring the top experts in all fields for our attorney clients' matters. World-class experts like the two gentlemen I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing you to today. Mr. Jerry Davis has decades of experience in the supply chain, third-party logistics, and reverse logistics industries, starting in the grocery store industry in the 1970s. Jerry has negotiated more than 100 contracts between 3PLs and clients, and is an experienced testifying expert as well, aiding clients in multi-million-dollar matters and having testified before Congress on behalf of the food and transportation industries. Dr. Zal Feroz is an experienced expert on global supply chain management, specializing in supply chain analytics, operations management, and data analytics, and has consulted with and provided expert testimony for various Fortune 500 companies on these issues. Zal has had multiple faculty appointments, including Harvard University, and his current position at the University of California, San Diego. Most recently, Zal has published a book on this topic titled Perspectives of Supply Chain Competitiveness, a Handbook. More detailed information about both of our experts on our event website. I will also be providing my contact information in the event you're interested in potentially engaging our experts for any of your matters. Without further ado, my first question is addressed to Mr. Jerry Davis. Jerry, during a disruptive event like COVID-19, how can small retailers ensure that manufacturers are not showing favoritism to certain chains? For instance, would a company like Walmart, that obviously serves many more customers than smaller retailers, be given preference for particular goods? And what steps can small retailers take to avoid this disparity?
Well, I've had a number of years' experience in dealing with Walmart and Target and Amazon and the big players, and I can promise you one thing: they're trying to get special treatment. They don't want holes in their shelves; they want their competitors to have holes in theirs. And if I were a 5, 10, 15, 20 store supermarket operator, I'd be very concerned that the buyers of Walmart aren't strong arming the manufacturers to get them the lion's share of the product. And during the beginning of the pandemic, when you couldn't get toilet paper, you couldn't get hand sanitizer, or anything that included bleach, you couldn't buy it anywhere. That was one of my thoughts, was that that the guys from Amazon are pounding on the manufacturers to get as much of this stuff as they can. And the smaller guys are really at a loss for that. All of the big manufacturers, the Procter & Gamble's of the world, Scott Papers of the world, those folks are going to try and be equitable. But, once you get a little farther down the food chain in terms of manufacturers, they're really susceptible to pressure from the big guys. So, I would, if I were a smaller guy, I'd be asking questions. Now, did you provide me? Was I getting fair treatment? If I represent 3% of your business, was I getting 3% of your product? Asking those kinds of questions. And we'll talk about it, I think, a little later on in another question. I'd be looking at my purchase order and my buying contracts, with manufacturers to make sure that they are pledged to give us equitable treatment. I mean, there are Robinson-Patman, considerations that manufacturers have to take into account in terms of restraint of trade. And if I were a smaller guy, I'd be making sure that the manufacturers knew that I was paying attention, because it's the, I don't want to overuse the word existential threat, but it certainly is for a small retailer relative to Walmart and Amazon and Target and everybody else. If they can't get product, they won't survive. So they've got to fight for their rights.
a supply chain disaster like we've kind of seen here, this isn't necessarily unique. There's been a number of times in which we've had these, quote unquote, supply chain disasters, whether there's a hurricane or a typhoon or an earthquake or whatnot, and a section of the supply chain has actually been impacted to the point where everything needs to be transitioned to a new method, new methodology, new structure altogether. With what we're seeing in a situation like this, if there is a delay in the distribution of goods and the need to prolong storage for certain items, there could be potential for spoilage. There could be the potential for product damage. Other issues might be placed. As an example, if there is a scenario in which a product needs to be distributed by way of cold trailers or refrigerated trailers, or if the product needs to be kept in some sort of a cold storage, or if the product needs some sort of maintenance or regular care throughout a duration in which employees are no longer employed or are not present on the scene, there could be vulnerabilities in the actual product consistency, product integrity. It's interesting because this reminds me of another case, the case with Mattel, the doll making company. They make Barbie dolls. Anybody who has kids has heard of Mattel. It's interesting because Mattel came into a problem with quality assurance from a little bit of a different reason. Some years ago, they were forced to execute on a rather large recall. The reason for why is because they were basically offshoring their production to production facilities in China, and because of the pricing pressure that they faced locally, domestically, with Walmart not continually pushing their pricing down, what they essentially had to do was offset that pressure to their manufacturers in China, who were also trying to lower their costs as much as possible. As a result, what happened was the manufacturers needed to resolve to use cheaper materials and needed to avoid certain areas of quality control. At the end of the day, it was discovered that some of these dolls came up with lead-based paint, which resulted in a massive recall. There's been a number of different cases in which I've been an expert in that have focused specifically on these areas, where there's been pressure from all kinds of angles that have resulted in kind of a downward pressure in terms of price, and as a result, the likelihood of just kind of overlooking certain quality control issues and quality control measures. With a situation like we have now with COVID and everything having stopped, slowed down, and everything resuming now, but at a 50% capacity, with all sorts of different safety measures in, with perhaps a skeleton workforce, we are almost more than likely inclined to see situations in which there has to be focus on getting things up and running at the cost of perhaps maintaining the same integrity of quality from a supply chain perspective, specifically distribution, manufacturing, and storage, as opposed to perhaps before.
In the same vein, would you, in your opinion, do distributors have a duty to examine these products to ensure that they're free from defects?
In terms of quality assurance, typically distributors are responsible for certain nodes of the supply chain. So the notion of distribution is not necessarily just one arm. There's distribution from supplier to the manufacturer to the warehouse to distribution center to the retailer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if we look at online selling, we can actually see that distribution actually doesn't necessarily revolve in-house anymore. It's more so a third-party logistics arm that might be being used, or FedEx or UPS or any of these entities that are basically managing the distribution of the actual product to the door of a consumer. In many cases, we're looking at a consumer product. What this means is that we are seeing kind of a shift in terms of demand. A shift in terms of demand means that there might not necessarily be that level of quality assurance that we were expecting to receive or had expected in a previous time, pre-COVID. And from a quality assurance perspective, distribution basically needs to ensure certain things. It needs to ensure product is stacked in a certain way, stored in a certain way, distributed in a certain way. Even when it's being distributed on a truck, usually these trucks are either going to be at capacity because of the amount of weight that they can hold on their trailer, or the amount of size that they can actually squeeze into their trailer. So, there's a number of different guidelines and regulations that actually need to be observed. From a safety perspective, we kind of open up an entire new can of worms, because from a safety perspective, there might be new conditions and new guidelines in which protective equipment is needed when unloading and loading and moving product. And if this is the case, this could potentially require more time. I don't know if anybody's seen store shelves being replenished, and there's inevitably someone there who's cleaning, and as we kind of go to a post-COVID kind of world, we're actually seeing a lot of changes in the way people are actually using their time. Businesses are actually using employees' time. What's interesting is that usually there's actually fewer employees because of the need to have downsized. Now, what this may mean is that as these measures come and become more and more conventional and become more and more expected, there might be vulnerabilities and actual quality issues, stacking issues, storage issues, because now all of a sudden we're seeing retail outlets, warehouses, distribution centers, manufacturing centers, even distribution arms that are operating with a 75%, for example, employee base, and requiring a 125% amount of time, because they need to measure various, they need to basically be on top of certain areas of disinfecting, these types of things. So we're seeing a push and a squeeze kind of in two different ways that begs the question, where is the shortfall? Inevitably, that shortfall has to come from somewhere, and you would almost assume that that's going to be possibly at the cost of quality control and quality assurance.
I think this is really the crux of the whole COVID supply chain question. And prior, as I think everybody knows, prior to this, online retailing was garnering an ever increasing piece of the retail pie. Every year it went up and up. The numbers on Black Friday, and Cyber Monday, they're all over the news. But there's no question that online purchasing prior to COVID was an ever increasing part of the retail landscape. And as such, bigger companies, certainly the Walmarts and Targets of the world, were increasing their online presence and backing that up with the fulfillment capability. In a traditional brick and mortar retail store, you've got manufacturers shipping products to distribution centers that are generally owned by the retailer, but sometimes operated by a third party, but generally owned by the retailer. And then those distribution centers distributing those products to their individual stores. And sometimes after they made a delivery, they would stop by a manufacturer's plant and back all the next load of products into their distribution center. And it was just a big, circle happening. And that's the way it was for years. With the advent of online retailing, the development of fulfillment centers really became important. And the thing that's really important to note is that if you look at JCPenney and the offerings that they have in their store, they might have 75,000, 80,000 SKU shopkeeping units available for purchase in one of their brick and mortar store. But if you go to their online location, they might have 250,000 shopkeeping units available. And that is a whole different animal. When you don't have to have a brick and mortar store with a facing, that you've got to replenish every day or every other day, then you can have a whole lot more offerings for your customers. Because in a fulfillment center, the fastest moving items will have a 1 pallet, 2 pallets, or 3 pallet facing that order pickers pick individual units from into a carton. Carton gets full, seal it up, ship it to the consumer. And because they can do that in bulk, they need many fewer fulfillment centers. They're bigger, and they can handle hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different items and manufacturers, unlike brick and mortar. So I think that, and I think the data will show very soon, that the pandemic is going to accelerate that shift from brick and mortar purchasing for consumers to online. And that's going to cause these brick and mortar retailers the need to accelerate their fulfillment capabilities. Now, fortunately for the big guys, the Walmarts of the world, they had fulfillment capabilities, and Walmart.com is a fully functioning business. Amazon certainly is getting a greater and greater share of all purchases. Their stock price is, showing that. But the medium-sized retailers, if they're going to survive, they're going to have to be able to gin up this fulfillment capability very quickly and be able to. And it's a whole different set of skill sets. I mean, it's a different animal than operating a pallet in and a case out, distribution center. I mean, it's pallet in and individual unit out. You've got to be able to bill. You've got to be able to credit. All from the fulfillment center. And it's a much tougher software question. It's much more difficult material handling issues. The size issues of the facilities are way different than the distribution centers. And converting some of the distribution capability and the fulfillment capability will be, I think, the challenge for these mid-sized retailers. But if they don't do it, I don't think they're going to survive. So it's I think, going to be the lasting legacy of this pandemic from the supply chain point of view is going to be the accelerating shift from brick and mortar to online sales. So it's going to be a big deal in supply chain.
Right. Thank you, Jerry. And related to that, with the huge increase in online purchasing, have you seen refund and return policies of these businesses remain in effect, or are they going to change as a result of the pandemic?
Well, historically, online retailers have used their, and to a certain extent, brick and mortar retailers as well, that have used their return policies as a merchandising point, as a way to differentiate themselves from their competitor. UPS did a study, it was about 3 years ago, where they surveyed consumers across the country. And one of the big takeaways from that was that consumers said that whether or not the online retailer had a 100% return guarantee with the online retailer paying the shipping, that was a determinative factor as to whether or not they would shop with that retailer. And I think that's the retailers really have taken that to heart. So you see most online retailers have very liberal return policies that include paying for shipping. Now they also will have algorithms, in their return software that looks out for people who might abuse that. And you see instances where Amazon will reach out to a customer and say, "Hey, you're returning, 60% of everything I ship you. You're either going to have to stop doing that, or I'm not going to be able to sell you anymore." And that's happened. And people will abuse, return privileges every way they can. You get the prom dress gets returned 3 days after the prom. The camcorder comes back after, the wedding. That kind of stuff happens. But retailers are looking closely for it. So I think that what you're going to see is that these return policies are going to uniformly be liberal. And, they're all going to have to do it just to be able to survive, because consumers want those return privileges.
Right.
They demand it from their retailer.
Typically, what we are kind of seeing, and I've spoken at a number of conferences on this, what we're kind of seeing is that there's been kind of a shift in terms of paradigm, in terms of people who were specifically against online purchasing. They would only buy in store, and people who were moving towards online purchasing. It's kind of been a trend that's been kind of shifting more and more and more towards the online side over the last 20 years, 15 years. With COVID-19, things have accelerated in that there have been certain categories of people in certain segments who have been almost forced to kind of take on, online purchasing as their natural way of buying product and kind of, using various things. What this has kind of created as we move into a post-COVID kind of world is certain segments who would have never gone online and are now buying online. What this is doing, if we look at it from a little bit of a bird's eye view, or a little bit of a higher perspective, is it might be changing demand patterns, and projecting where those demand patterns are kind of moving towards is going to be a little bit chaotic when it comes to businesses who are actually figuring out what to do. In other words, a traditional supply chain works by way of projecting demand and figuring out exactly where demand is going to be on each node of the supply chain. But when we have different types of consumerism that are taking place in different types of buying patterns, we might see a shift of that demand, and we might see situations in which manufacturers are overshipping or overproducing. Product is expiring because there's not enough buying that takes place, or there might be reductions in cost to kind of get that product out, and it overall is not necessarily cultivating an atmosphere of a nice, easy progression that can be kind of forecasted and projected. All of a sudden, we've taken various segments that were nowhere in the realm, near the realm of online shopping and had nothing to do with it, to now, having the need for companies to basically attend to these groups altogether. There's a number of vulnerabilities across the chain, and I'll use a very simple example. If someone goes into a retailer, be it a Walmart, and buys something, whatever it is, and they get home and the product's defective or it's dangerous or it causes some sort of an injury, that consumer rarely thinks to go to the supplier or the outsourced manufacturer that's offshore. They'll go to one of two sources. One will be the retailer, so Walmart will be held accountable and their reputation will suffer, or they'll go to the manufacturer, or both. And as a result, the entire supply chain, the integrity of the supply chain isn't called into question, but the integrity of the supply chain is basically where the root of the problem is. So the manufacturer who chose to use that supplier, who is cutting costs because of lack of manpower, et cetera, is responsible in large part for a situation like this, but not necessarily accountable. If we look at this, we can kind of see that as things are kind of moving to picking up, things are moving faster. There might be less workers. There's almost likely going to be a little bit of a push to kind of resume the economy. There's a lot of competition, a lot of businesses that have kind of been stopped, and a lot of manufacturing that's been restricted because of the lack of ability to send product in from offshore, from China, et cetera, because of the regulations. What this is going to lead to inevitably is a slowdown in production that may have created vulnerabilities in the chain, and now almost a push to resume production as quickly as possible. The problem is that in many cases, we may have a lack of personnel. We may have a lowered level of manpower. And we may have quality assurance standards, COVID-related standards, that might result in the need to speed up production because of these standards and these guidelines taking up even that much more time. If we look at what I was just mentioning in terms of the switching in demand and to rely on online purchasing, what we may also see is that all of a sudden those retail outlets that were in charge of stacking product and storing product and knew exactly what the standards were, et cetera, to make sure that the integrity of a product was in place, that responsibility might be alleviated, might be taken away. It might now be on the side of the distributor. So think about, if I'm looking at a completely arbitrary example, think about a FedEx delivery person who is delivering a TV, not necessarily knowing that they're only supposed to stack it 3 high or 5 high because it's in the back of a delivery truck, not necessarily knowing that when they put it on a porch, it's supposed to be upright instead of flat. There's countless examples that we can kind of touch on, and in various cases that I've worked on, even pre-COVID, these have been examples that have come up. If we look at other areas, we can actually see that these could be precursors for larger situations that may take place from an insurance standpoint. From vulnerabilities that might take place in terms of insurance for production, manufacturing defects as a result of poor quality control. And we can also see that in general, we're actually shifting where the responsibility is for these products. In the past, it was the retailer that was responsible for holding these products. Now, it's a third-party distributor that's responsible for the last mile. It's someone who's driving a a delivery truck who's been contracted to deliver these products. If the damage takes place during that last mile, who's responsible? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the distributor? Is it that outsourced? All of these questions come up. And in many cases, we can kind of look and point to all sorts of reasons, but in general, the likelihood is that it's going to be caused by a lack of manpower, a push to resume economic activity and remain competitive amongst other companies that are also trying to do the same thing, and a complete shift in demand cycles in terms of how people are actually buying. The fact that more and more people are buying online, and the fact that things are kind of changing in terms of where product is being sourced, how product is being manufactured, what quality assurance standards there are. That's even delaying the entire chain even more.
Right.
Just to build on that for a second, one of the things that retailers and manufacturers have done pre-COVID is they have begun, and Walmart really led the way on this. They have negotiated buying arrangements where a retailer would take an off-invoice allowance from everything that they bought from a manufacturer in lieu of having return capabilities. So Walmart negotiates with Sony and said, I've done all this research and analysis. I know what my returns are at the store. The average brick and mortar retailer has a between 9 and 10% return rate. And they know that. And it's different by, it's made up differently by categories. Electronics are a little higher, shoes are maybe a little lower. Things that get tried on at the store are lower. Things that go home are a little higher. And just anecdotally, the online retailers have almost twice the return rate as the brick and mortar retailers do, because you don't have that touchy-feely thing happening. But so the Walmart negotiates with Sony and said, I'm taking 8/10 off of every invoice, but I'm never going to send you a return. And I'm going to take that product when it comes back, and what I will do with it is I'm going to sell it on the secondary market. The secondary market in North America now makes up almost 3% of GDP. Now think about that. And that's not counting used cars and houses, just consumer goods. It's 3% of GDP. It is a huge business. And so, Walmart has an operation in their return centers, and Amazon even more because of their double return rate, where they are selling truckloads and truckloads of store returns to different liquidators who are then selling it off to B retail stores or selling it off into flea market operators, or it's going all over. A lot of it gets exported, to South America or Europe, or a number of products going into the Middle East. So there's a whole thing that's happening out there relative to returns and damage and, the problems that Zal is talking about. And post-COVID, that's going to go up, because that double return rate, that 20% return rate for retailers, coupled with what Zal's talking about, is going to make a lot of liquidation product available in the marketplace. And something's got to give there, because I don't think it's a infinite appetite for it. Something's going to have to change. Be interesting to see what it is.
Right. Thank you. I was going to ask you, related to talking about return policies. Obviously, the fact that some companies may fail to give notice that they've changed their return policy, and whether you felt that failing to do so could lead to litigation like some of these other issues.
You go to the customer service desk at Walmart, there's a placard behind it that says, here's our return policy. Bring it back within X days with a receipt, and that's fine. That's the return policy. But I promise you, if you show up there, 10 days outside of the policy level with no receipt, and you raise your voice high enough, they're going to take it back. I mean, that's just the way the world works. They will very quickly be reinstituting their return policy just as soon as they can. Now, the food guys will be the last to do that. There isn't a lot of returns that happen in a supermarket. You take home some strawberries and they didn't turn out to be good, you might take them back. But they will very quickly return too. So I don't think we're going to see litigation. I think these guys are frankly anxious to get back to their return policies, because it's just giving another advantage to the online sellers. In my past, I was a president of a big wholesale grocery company, and I can promise you, if I had that job again, my purchase orders would now say something different than they did pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
They'd be looking for guarantees that my purchase orders are going to be fulfilled to the best of the ability of the manufacturer. My buying contracts would be talking about what percentage am I of your business and making sure that I get that percentage at the minimum of your output, and have some follow-up mechanisms in it to be able to audit the fact that, if you had 100,000 cases to sell and I'm 10% of your business, I better have gotten 10,000 of them. That kind of thing. I would be building some audit capabilities into that. I do not believe that any of that exists today. It didn't,
Right.
to my knowledge, prior to COVID, but it certainly will be post-COVID.
To mitigate these delays, we might be seeing almost a movement away from globalization. The term globalization has, become relatively popular over the last little while. However, now with the potential for a virus like this, we might see future supply chains become almost more localized, in which there might be a shift away to smaller supply chains. We might have the need to have more of a control. Perhaps that would result in higher cost as well, but localized storage, for example, to reduce lead times and more dependence on local distribution, be it last mile delivery or third party distribution, just to remove the focus point on being low labor costs and paying a tariff but getting the product made elsewhere. These might be the results simply because it at cost of a higher product value or higher product price reduces the risk of an actual shutdown and slowdown. So these are the patterns that, from a supply chain analytics standpoint, just by looking at data and by looking at some of the resulting moves that various companies have made, as well as some of the other cases that I've worked on as an expert, and kind of some of the patterns that we're seeing are becoming a little bit more prevalent post-COVID as opposed to how things were pre-COVID.
And I think another aspect of it will be on the brick and mortar fulfillment distribution center side. There's going to have to be some significant fulfillment capability added, even to the Walmarts of the world, who have significant fulfillment capability. But a lot of other retailers are going to need to, muscle up on their fulfillment capabilities to deal with the switch to online sales. Now, that may create opportunities in the third-party logistics world for the bigger 3PLs to get in a major way into the fulfillment business, which most of them aren't at this point. But I think you may see the XPOs of the world, starting to really have some fulfillment capability, and that's going to take some time, and I think could cause disruption and delay. The other thing that is going to be interesting to see how it fleshes out is the shortage of truck drivers. And now you see, you can hardly go into a neighborhood any time of the day or evening without seeing a prime truck driving around. And those guys are replacing, to a certain extent, not completely, the CDL drivers. I think we may see fewer products in CDL drivers, which in CDL-driven trucks, which is good because there's a significant shortage of commercial truck drivers these days. And I don't see that getting any better because it's just a lifestyle that most people don't want too much to do about. I actually honestly think we may see, as hard as it is to believe, I can't believe I'm going to say it, we may see a reversion back to some railroad shipments, from manufacturers into distribution centers as opposed to 100% truckload. Now, most retailers have long filled in their inside railroad unloading capabilities, fill them in with concrete to make more floor space. You may see some of that concrete getting shipped out. so that make room for the rail cars again.
Very interesting. Thank you, Jerry. So I'll ask this question of you as well, and then ask Zal for his thoughts. Do you think there's going to be a permanent consumer behavior shift created by COVID-19? And if so, how will it affect contractual obligations and business interests?
Well, I think that COVID is just going to, be the biggest nail in the coffin of the shopping mall. They were dying before COVID, and it's hard to believe that many, if any, of these, enclosed shopping malls are going to survive this. And that's going to create a lot of real estate issues, and things like that are going to have to be dealt with. But there is just no question in my mind, and I think anybody who thinks about these kinds of problems would say that this is just accelerating the switch from brick and mortar to online sales. That retailers, if they're going to survive, are going to have to be able to make that switch too. We got some companies like Marshalls and TJX, and some of these guys have been very slow to the online sales arena. Now they benefit from the increased product going into the secondary market through liquidations, because a high percentage of the products they sell in their brick and mortar stores come from liquidation products. But if you're not able to do fulfillment and direct to consumer, I think you got a problem in the next 10 years.
I mean, as of the last 4 months, you can almost see the differences in terms of how patterns of behavior are actually shaping. Everything from how people are queuing in a store to how many people are allowed into a store to how many people are allowed into a shopping mall. Anything that's brick and mortar, there are so many restrictions and guidelines on it, which is further killing the notion of an in-person kind of shopping experience. Before, the notion of buying online was relatively easy and quick, but you didn't have the ability to touch and feel and go in, and the experience wasn't there. Now, people have been accustomed to buying in that fashion, and even more so, the people who want to go back to the store are almost being inconvenienced in certain ways, but without making it sound as bad as that. Because now, there's all sorts of restrictions and capacity guidelines and these types of things, which means inevitably, from a supply chain standpoint, that demand has become 10 times harder to project and forecast, and the amount of sell-through and turnover that those in brick and mortar stores are going to face is going to be lessened to an extensive degree. In the past, what you'd see, retailers, including Walmart, would have bulky items that were not sold too often be online. And so someone would walk into the store, and if they wanted something, they wouldn't be able to get it in the store. They'd have to go online to buy it. Now, it would be interesting to see if we actually see a switch over altogether, where we actually see the in-person stores holding product that nobody really wants, and you have to go pick it up, whereas the online side is for more frequent deliveries. And if that takes place, that transformation happens, the entire supply chain overall has basically reversed in terms of the advantages and disadvantages for certain types of products.
All of the retailers, brick and mortar retailers, automated buying systems, all got smoke coming out of their ears, trying to figure out what's going on. And the whole concept of safety stock in a distribution center. You want a regular distribution center for pick anybody. They want to have a 97, 98%, order fill rate. So they're not out of stock 97 or 98% of the time. Well, in order to do that, you've got to have safety stock built into a bunch of those items so that, you can deal with the fluctuations of it. And what's going on now is blowing the roof off of all of that stuff. I mean, it's crazy. They're going to be finding inventory in some of these warehouses 3 years from now, wondering why they still have it. It's crazy time out there.
Thank you so much to both Jerry Davis, Zal Feroz. That concludes our inaugural discussion of the Roundtable Group. Thank you to our attendees for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us on a Friday afternoon during these unusual times, to say the least. Thank you again, everyone. Happy Friday.